Hi, I'm Steve Koepp, co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited about this topic. But before we get started, I want to share something special we have for today's attendees. One of our monthly virtual conferences is coming up on Wednesday, November 17th, and it's titled Building a Skilled Team: How Upskilling, Coaching, and Recognition Can Help. It's going to be particularly valuable for employers who are looking for creative ways to attract top talent and keep them engaged. Thanks to our partners and today's sponsor, we have some complimentary VIP tickets available for those who joined today's webinar. That would be you. I'm putting a link in the chat right now, and I think you'll want to take advantage of this one. The regular price for our conference tickets is $149, and this link will give you a free VIP ticket for the whole day's activities. Thanks for checking that out. Today, we'll be exploring the topic, empowering managers to lead a more flexible workforce. With hybrid work, rigid structures won't be effective in giving managers the discretion they need to help employees do their best work. What are the best ways to give managers the autonomy they need while maintaining accountability for strong performance toward your organization's goals? Our sponsor today is 15Five, and I'll tell you a bit about them. 15Five combines engagement, performance, and OKR solutions on one platform, enabling HR leaders to drive meaningful business impact and create highly engaged, high-performing organizations. 15Five's easy-to-use software, education, coaching, and community provides HR leaders with the tools and holistic support they need to create better managers and thriving employees. Now, a few quick logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with the link. That email will also have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from the Society of Human Resource Management. And also look out for a written account of this conversation on our website at fromday1.co. Now I'd like to introduce our mainstay moderator, Lydia Dishman, a staff editor for Fast Company, who's an expert on topics including leadership, technology, and the workplace, and where they all meet. Lydia has also written for CBS Money Watch, Fortune, Popular Science, and the New York Times, among others. Okay, Lydia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks everyone. We're so happy that you could join us today, and we appreciate you spending an hour with us. I want to start by talking about some recent research that I came across from Gartner, and it said that only 44% of employees say that they trust their organization's leaders and managers to navigate a crisis well. Now it's not just about navigating a crisis, but figuring out how to lead when teams are remote and/or hybrid, and often communicating asynchronously. And while leaders attempt to figure it out, it might be helpful to note that older research notes that micromanagement can be advantageous in certain short-term situations, such as when you're training new employees, increasing productivity of underperforming employees, or controlling high-risk issues. That's when you have to have no question of who's in charge. But the cost associated with long-term micromanagement can be exorbitant. Symptoms such as low employee morale, high staff turnover, reduction of productivity, and dissatisfaction are all linked to micromanagement. So, to further explore the best way to walk the line between autonomy and accountability without being overbearing, I have with me today Santiago Jaramillo, and he's a nationally recognized expert and keynote speaker on employee engagement, organizational culture, and entrepreneurship. Santi is also the co-author of Agile Engagement, an Amazon bestseller that provides employers with a framework for measuring employee engagement and achieving unprecedented business value through maximizing the workforce's potential. He's the co-founder and former CEO of Emplify, which is now part of 15Five, and Santi's led a team of experts for many years supporting leading organizations in their mission to attract, engage, and retain the best talent. In 2013, Santi was named to Inc. magazine's 30 Under 30. He's also been invited to the White House by the Obama administration for recognition of his entrepreneurial contributions through the Champions of Change program. Most recently, he was named to Indianapolis Business Journal's 40 Under 40. We're seeing your age progression there, Santi. In 2015 as one of the youngest honorees in the program's history. And in 2016, he was named Indiana Latino Businessman of the Year. So Santi, Very impressive resume there. Thanks for being with me today. And I'd like you to start by telling us what you see the differences between managers and leaders.
Yes, thank you so much, Lydia. It is an honor and a privilege to get to be with you all today. We are in times of change, really wild, interesting times from the vantage point of work and how we manage and lead humans in today's world. So really honored to be here and excited about our conversation today. You know, it's a fantastic question. The difference between managers and leaders. You know, I think there is a difference, very much so. I think one can be a really excellent manager and perhaps a poor leader, and the other way around. There's probably some areas of overlap, so probably not totally mutually exclusive contests. But I think when the mentality of management is one about control and seeking to turn chaos into predictability. It is sort of an organization emotion. It seeks to understand what problems need to be solved and how do we solve them with the constraints that we have. If we go back to McKinsey, tons of like sort of organizational cultural issues, but I do like this one kind of framing that they shared about the frontier of leadership. And back in the so scientific management was the first sort of study of management. It only became a thing with like Henry Ford and the Ford assembly line. And right, so the idea there was you got to get a car out and like it's got to be like predictable, because it's, you know, if you like forget a couple screws, like bad, right? And so what did managers do? Managers was all about IQ, sort of an intellectual motion of how do we sort of create milestones for the car, and how do we division of labor? How do we create experts at like one person turns a screw to the left and the next person bolts the thing, and the next person gets really good at doing like 1,000 things at once. And that was like the most efficient way to organize work and create a predictable assembly line. Like management was something that was created like as a response to the work that was needed of the Industrial Revolution, essentially, how to basically turn off people's like emotions and psychologies and just get them to do rote mechanical tasks over and over. Now, I don't want to paint management as some outdated thing that has no value today. No. I think like the ideal is someone who in a place of management or leadership is they can be a great manager and a great leader. But when you think about, so McKinsey talked about this, the first frontier was IQ. The second one was EQ. This idea that started in the 50s and 60s with research around like we have emotions and they affect the work and we should care about them. We should treat people with respect. And so it was no longer good enough to just be like a manager who just treated people horribly and yelled at them, but like got the job done. All of a sudden you had to like mind the human emotions, and that was about EQ and IQ and EQ. Now, McKinsey says the frontier of leadership, and I believe I agree, is as MQ. Is not just only the ability to organize parts and get predictable outcomes and work with humans in respectful and kind ways, but it's how leaders are able to create a sense of meaning in the work of employees, MQ. So it's about all three together, IQ, EQ, and MQ. And we as humans get meaning from so much. I just reread Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning that talks about.
Yes, I was thinking about this book also just today. Go on.
Yeah, you know, and it's one of the most fundamental, not to sort of go really deep into philosophy, but it's one of the most fundamental questions we ask ourselves of our human existence is like, why are we here?
Yes.
What is our meaning in this world? And we as humans ascribe meaning to all sorts of things, because he kind of found 5 sources of meaning at work. I'm going to try to see if I can remember them. One of them was like the customer. Some people are just like really pumped about making the customer happy and helping the customer, right? These folks are in customer support roles and other roles as well. You know, people, self is one of them. Like I work so I can pay for my kids' college education or buy that lake house or, you know, support my golf habit or whatever it is. These are not, I don't play golf and I don't have a lake house, but these are just sort of random examples that came to mind. The organization, some people are just really pumped about contributing to the organization and making an impact for the organization they work with. Some get really jazzed about society, like this company makes a difference for society and it makes the world better.
Mhm.
And another one is team. The fifth one, I actually remembered all five of them, is I get a sense of meaning and satisfaction by working together with other people, chasing a common goal,
Mhm.
having a sense of connection, and doing something that helps my immediate teammate who is in the trenches along with me. And so so I think that that's an interesting way to think about it. So managers is this kind of sort of this IQ motion of how do we predictably get to goals, a managerial culture. And interestingly, different organizations have more cultures of leadership, and actually their growth path is like organizing stuff better and having more managerial cultures, and other cultures have very managerial cultures without really strong leadership cultures. When the two come together, it can be really, really powerful. Some of the things that it takes to be a great manager, I think, is persistence, tough-mindedness, hard work, intelligence, analytical ability. But when you think about, more of this idea of leaders, instead of trying to necessarily harness chaos and turn it into predictability, leaders, in contrast, I think sometimes tolerate chaos and a lack of structure, and maybe are willing to delay, making a decision or closing a loop on something to actually understand the issue more fully. Business leaders have some more in common with like artists and creative thinkers almost, and almost a mystical kind of idea. It happens at an emotional and psychological level. So I think that the managers is how do you organize predictable inputs to unpredictable inputs into predictable outputs, and leadership is more of an art. The art of inspiring emotion and psychology. It's being able to draw out and inspire engagement from your team. And if we define employee engagement, wrote a book on it, it's head, heart, and hands.
Mm-hmm.
Employee engagement is not just engaging someone's intellect, it's engaging their heart and their sort of the seat of emotions. And this is now required in a new context, because before we didn't need at work, business leaders didn't need people's hearts to build a Model T. But now we're in knowledge work, and we work and live in a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. New things and new inputs are coming all the time. We have to dig deep and actually care about problems and care about the customer and care about the business to come up with 10x, 100x better solutions. That's why an engaged plumber can be 30-50% more productive than a disengaged plumber. But an engaged software engineer can come up with 1,000x better solution to a technical problem because of the sort of productivity equation of that. So I think leadership, I think, is what is most called for. We've been managing well in general, and it is a skill set and a valuable skill set. But I think that today's world is really, really shifting, and I think the value of real leadership. And we've seen macro examples of good and bad leadership, and how that can really, really impact the tone and the emotionality of a nation, a state, and certainly an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. You're touching on this briefly, but I want to hit this more directly. This notion of MQ being sort of a recent-ish development. What are the newer developments, the newer trends that you're seeing, especially with regards to your work? I think that there is no playbook for leaders anymore. We threw it out in March of 2020. And what are you seeing now that we're 18 months into this grand chaotic experiment?
Yes. So there was a bunch of changes that were happening before the pandemic that were just massively accelerated. So we speak with I speak with literally hundreds of HR leaders, some of the best HR teams out there, and it's really interesting how they're supporting highly engaged, high performance teams has changed. Before it used to be this kind of idea of, and this started changing years and years ago. But if you think about where HR came up, it was benefits and compensation. 30 years ago, the reason why somebody stayed at GE or GM, if you ask them why they literally gave 30 years of their life, half of their waking hours to one company, they would say good compensation, stable job, and a pension fund,
A pension,
right?
yes. The pension
was
was everything.
Was everything. That was the tacit agreement of work. I
Mhm.
show up, I give you work, I give you most of my waking life. I do my, put my head down, do the job in a command and control structure,
Yes.
and I get back compensation benefits. That whole contract between the employee and the employer has just sort of blown up.
Mhm.
And it's blown up. And I'm not saying that compensation and benefits are not important. I'm just saying it's really not it's commoditized now. Every single organization in HR, like paying people on time and giving them benefits is kind of table stakes in terms of like differentiating your culture to attract great talent. Certainly.
Right. So what else you got?
So what else you got, right? And employees now are basically like, so Glassdoor did research on this, and they basically asked employees like, what do you want the most? And this is like knowledge workers. And compensation and benefits was 6th on the list of why they chose to go work somewhere and why they chose to stay. This is like really interesting. Like, what's above benefits and compensation now? Like, what are people looking for from work? And they're looking at work-life balance.
Yes.
They're looking at the business outlook, like where's the company headed in the future because of all this change. Is it going to be one of the winners or losers in all of the chaos that's happening? Growth and development as a person. Well, can I grow somewhere? The quality and authenticity and alignment of leadership and management, and the cultural values. So that's really interesting. Like, we're getting at leadership things here now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Leadership, cultural values, a sense of I'm developing and I'm growing and I'm achieving more of my potential, and I'm able to be more of my best and full self at work. And where can I go find that can provide an appropriate amount of compensation? Even if I need to take a pay cut, I will go work for somewhere. And what's interesting is that has shifted a lot of the responsibility of this. HR is still tremendously important, and its importance inside of an organization continues to grow. But if you think about who really delivers the employee experience to an individual past the first 90 days, it's really the manager in the team context, not HR, right? HR plays an incredible, important role and in so many areas, but in hiring and onboarding, right? Yeah, mostly HR, but then that ends, and all of a sudden HR kind of is there for when problems are there or open enrollment happens, or to create sort of centralized structures and policies that affect the org. But it's really the manager that has like arisen to deliver more of what talent wants in this new age. So HR finds themselves in a really interesting place where they don't necessarily control the managers, right? Because the managers report to directors and executives and the CEO. And so they're sort of leading with this kind of influence versus this direct authority. And so what's really interesting is the best HR teams now are really focusing on how do they equip, enable, and support managers to be truly excellent and thrive in today's world. And the role of the manager is more important than ever, right? You have the pandemic and folks are struggling with where do we work and how do we work? Last year, specifically, we were dealing with so many societal and political issues.
Yes.
And those conversations coming into the work setting in sort of historically intense ways. And all of a sudden, managers had to be like emotional supporters of their direct reports. They had to navigate diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations at work. They had to figure out how, the pandemic was politicized. And so we had to navigate how do we respond to a health crisis. And so the job of the manager got harder than ever and more important than ever. And HR has just an incredibly important role in helping shape the infrastructure by which managers kind of operate. And what's wild, though, is that most organizations don't really invest in their managers. 2/3 of senior executives say that manager development and leadership development is like their top concern, according to McKinsey. Just
because it's a concern doesn't mean that that's where the resources and the funds are going. So
exactly. It was wild. Stat from SHRM: 47% of new managers do not receive management training or coaching.
And that number is absolutely astounding to me. And that kind of leads me to another question that I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
You mentioned HR setting the foundation, and I said many times over the last year through these webinars, so hello to the people who've heard me say this before. Sorry to tire your ears, but HR was the unsung hero of the pandemic. A lot of CHROs were acting as de facto counselors to so many people, but the managers themselves were doing this day-to-day heavy lift. And yet without training, especially in staggering numbers like that, and also, again, without this leadership playbook, nobody really knew how to do this before we went into a period of such great chaos. So my question to you is, how do you see managers being empowered enough so that they can become these de facto leaders instead of just, making sure that the KPIs are met?
Yeah. I think part of the answer is leadership development, is developing the parts. So I think phase one is ensuring manager 101 basics and foundations. And you'd be surprised how often those aren't met. Things like having a regular one-on-one with each direct report every week or every 2 weeks or whatever. But it's some things that are important with this is that it's continuous, meaning that it's scheduled and it's repeating. And it's at the same time, it's predictable. They can count, the direct report can count on this communication, and the one-on-one can be the lifeblood of communication between the employee and the manager. Not the only one, right? Slack and asynchronous communication can happen, but having a place for synchronous conversation where the person knows that they're going to have full attention, I think is really important. Manager 101, things like how to set goals, how to create a vision, how to co-create a vision with a team. There's so many basics. So I think that's the main thing, is making sure that we are basically training the managerial capability. Because if that's the case, if they're a great artist as a leader, but just can't provide the deliberate and consistent and organized management foundations, I think it really limits the ability. But once we get past the basics and sort of the bread and butter of management, I think something that's really interesting with leadership is HBR came up with this idea of the leader as a coach.
Yes.
And it's profoundly impacted my view on what leadership is. And basically, the TLDR on this is that in the face of rapid disruptive change, like managers can't have all the answers because so many things are changing.
Right.
So this command and control model of like, this is what we're doing, it's unchanging, and then this is the way we do it, just like no longer cuts it, but it can't also be chaos. And so So a lot of organizations are moving to this idea of a coaching model where managers are facilitating problem solving by the individual. They're not telling them the answers, but they're the ones asking the questions. Leadership is about the questions we're asking, not about the answers we're telling them, and encouraging their development by asking questions and offering support and guidance rather than giving orders and making judgments.
Okay.
This is a very, very different posture. And I believe that the journey of leadership begins with like self-awareness of who one is. And at that point, we start to get at like leadership is the art of growing up, not growing up and like grow up, but like literally growing up into mature, healthy, emotionally well-rounded adults. And this is really interesting. So now it's the role of human resources to help people mature emotionally and psychologically, because that's what I have never seen an emotionally immature, psychologically immature great leader. You know what I'm saying? Like what keeps
with the caveat being great leader. We've seen emotionally immature leaders, but great leaders, not so much.
Exactly. And what holds them back, they may be in positions of leadership, but they're not actually leading. You know what I mean? And so that is a fascinating question for HR to need to develop a competency of how to help people mature emotionally and psychologically. Like it's just, to me, that's mind blowing that's like part of the job. But I think it really is. And so I think it's how do we make coaching an organizational capability?
And yeah, I mean, that kind of brings up this notion of what happens on a day-to-day basis? You mentioned asking questions without providing answers, and that is really key. The thing is, most people don't know how to ask the right questions. They'll just use the open-ended, how's it going? Well, if you're one of on the lower rung of the organization, what do you think you're going to answer to that question? Everything's fine. It's great. And so what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? What do you tell managers about asking those questions, about those communications?
Yeah. Some best practices on great question asking. If somebody wants a framework to kind of study appreciative inquiry, AI, not like artificial intelligence, is kind of a strengths-based positive approach, which basically says like, hey, what's going really well right now? Like what's making you come alive in your work that's really giving you a lot of energy? Listen, XYZ, and listening is like the most important part of asking questions. It helps you understand kind of where to go, and then saying, well, how could you have more of that? So in that, it's a positive kind of approach to it. Number one. Number two, it's a lot of like what questions, why questions are typically not as good. Why immediately people kind of get a little bit defensive, or why is that the case? Versus like, what's really kind of going on here. Open-ended questions are important versus, yes, no, right? These are just kind of like really basic 101s of good question asking. Another one is really kind of asking like, what's your number one challenge, or what's really keeping you from accomplishing your goals? And so these questions and this posture of support and encouragement and coaching works when there's a bunch of other stuff already in place. And the stuff that's already in place is the team is aware of the business context. That's like the job of the manager, is to translate what's going on in leadership priorities and business context and the world of the customer, and sharing that context
why I'm doing this.
with the team. The second step is understanding the context of the individuals in the team, meaning how are they doing? Are they burnt out? Are they like, don't have enough work to do? Understanding them each as individuals. What's their personality type? So if we understand the business, and then we translate as a manager, and we translate that to the team, and we understand the individuals in the team and the makeup of the team, then we can work with the team to say, let's co-create a vision and a strategy for the next month, 6 months, year, 10 years, whatever it is, and let's co-create it. And a vision is basically a description of the end outcome. Like in 3 years, this is what the world looks like if we succeed. A strategy is how we're going to get there. And we co-create that with the team in a way that the vision and the strategy matches what the organization needs and what's possible with the team. It's sort of the Venn diagram kind of middle overlap of what the team needs and wants and what the business wants. If that's the case, then the manager is in charge of creating a scoreboard of how do we know if we're succeeding on our way to that vision as we pursue that strategy. So then we have a vision, we have a strategy, we know how to do it. We have a scoreboard that tells us how we're doing in pursuit of that. And then the last step is to clarify roles and responsibilities. Who in the team is responsible for what? When all that's managerial stuff. When all that is there, that's when one-on-ones becomes really easy, because it's like, all right, let's pretend you're my like direct report, like Lydia, like, you know the vision, the strategy, you helped create it, like you're excited about it, like you know what the scoreboard is, you know what your role is in it, like how's it going, like how are you doing as a human, like what's preventing you from doing your best work, what's really going well, how do we like get you more into those streams of work that like really pump you up, like what's really drawing your energy right now, like what's really sucking like at work, is there anything that you can do that's in your control to like remove some of those obstacles? Is there anything that I can do to support you? Lydia, like you did something fantastic here, let's celebrate this because you helped with the scoreboard, or you like accomplished the vision, like how can I help you be more successful? It's really like it becomes really easy, kind of.
I was just going to say that.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's a sort of more organic evolution of that interaction, instead of having it be very performative and very performance-based, it sounds like. Just want to, while we're talking about questions, I wanted to remind our attendees, we are going to have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So if you want, drop some questions that you have into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So you mentioned, Santi, you mentioned challenges. And one of the things that I think managers who are maybe not as empowered as they could or should be have trouble making decisions. And maybe that's a little bit fear-based. You know, you've got people that don't want to do the wrong thing under any circumstances and maybe need a little extra nudge. How do you work with somebody like that just really, you know, needs to be more fearless?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's so dependent on the individual. For example, I am someone who each of us are kind of, I found, tripped up in different archetypal ways, I guess. For me, I'll get really impatient and not gather all the right data points before I make a decision. And then I'll like just rush the decision and make the wrong one. So for me, my path is remembering to have a little bit of patience. Other people's issue is like the opposite. They just love getting more data. They give me more data, give me more analysis. I want to think it over. And their path is something, you know, I think Jeff Bezos talked about, which is in a VUCA context, you have to get comfortable with making decisions when you have 60 or 70% of the data available to you. Because the difference of having 70% of the data available and 95% could be 6 months. And if you wait those 6 months to fill in the rest of the data, your competitors, everything will have changed. And a good enough decision with 60 or 70% of the data would have been, you know, good enough. And so I think you really depend on really understanding the individual and what's behind it. Do they not have the right data points to make the decision? Do they actually kind of know what the decision should be, but there's a systemic culture around them that really penalizes being wrong? And thus stifles innovation, because literally, like, innovation requires a high volume of experimentation. Inherent in a high volume of experimentation is a lot of failures, right? Or not positively validated things, if we want to sort of neutralize the language. So I think there's a lot of things. You know, I think the easiest way, one of the easiest ways, this is Jerry Colonna wrote a book called Reboot. I think it was Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. I think that's where I got that phrase of leadership is the art of growing up. And in that, he says that managers have a strong back and open heart. And I thought that was like a great sort of like non-dualistic way to like understand the right posture. And I, like, because of my childhood and you know, background, I have a lot of strong back, and sometimes in my past, I've struggled on the open-heartedness that this is the right business decision, right? And other people are the opposite. Like, they'll be like, like, I love this person. I mean, I don't like romantically love them, but like, I really like this person. I have a deep relationship with them, and they're failing in their role. We've tried everything, but like, let's not like give them clear feedback because it'll hurt their feelings. And that's like appreciate the open-heartedness, but there's more strong back, which is like, there's truth and love, like truth and kindness together is what is needed. You know, it's not kind to not be truthful and clear with somebody who is clearly not meeting the expectations and not set up for success in the role. Right. And so that can be an interesting way of like, is this a heart or a back issue? Do I have all the data and I'm struggling with the courage to make this decision? Or is it kind of the other way around? And that's a bit overly simplistic, but that strong back and open heart has stuck with me. And I find that people typically have a surplus of one, and their growth path is balancing the other one. It's in them, but it's sort of under there somewhere because of, you know, coping mechanisms and such.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with that, I think. And you know, I think that it's problematic, especially when you're talking about giving and receiving feedback. You know, I personally am not a fan of the compliment sandwich, because there's brain science behind hearing the negative part of it as the thing that really sticks with you. So it's not just me. I just wonder how managers are supposed to have those feedback conversations. What's the most productive way to offer feedback now? I'm also thinking about it in terms of maybe you're behind a screen. And you mentioned the one-on-ones being regular, but sometimes it's easier to give not so positive feedback from behind a screen. Easy place to hide. How do you deal with that?
It is. I find myself urging myself to have to not give feedback that's nuanced over asynchronous digital communication.
Can't get the tone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. The more that we, in-person cues are lost a lot in these settings, but it is what it is. But at least let's have the facial cues and the body language so that we can, so that I can have the situational awareness to understand, where things are going. Because if you're showing up jazzed and feeling great, and I've I've shared with you 10 positive affirmations and I've celebrated you, and you feel like you're succeeding and you're doing being able to, hey, there's this one thing that I noticed, and it had this impact on this person or on this thing, so sharing the impact, and that may be okay. But somebody who is coming in beat up, looks like they just had a terrible day and they just got off crying off the phone, that may not be the right time to go into that. And so I think so much is the situational awareness of what it's the iceberg is 80% of what has happened before that moment in terms of how to give the feedback. But I think clarity and kindness are the guiding principles. Truth, clarity, not mincing words, not trying to manage their feelings ahead of time, being really clear, but doing it with kindness and offering to be helpful, supportive, constructing in how the world changes, and asking and a request for change, not a mandate for change, but a request for change. And I found that people don't change when you say change. They change when they choose to change, right? Each person has agency, and so I think it's an invitation to a new way of being, and inviting them to say, hey, let me know if there's something I'm missing. I may be missing context. What do you think? How could that have gone a different way? And in inviting them to co-participate in the creation of a different way of doing things. But I've noticed that if we're talking, about how do you give feedback on somebody's design, a little kind of thing that's different. But if we're talking about hey, I've noticed a pattern of disrespect, we're talking about a strong personality, character, deeper kind of issue. I think in those cases, I honestly just totally forgot what I was going to say. So,
That's okay. That's okay. No, but the kindness piece is really important, and I can't say enough how much empathy has played a role in getting everybody through in some form or fashion over these last 18 months. But I'm thinking about, particularly with regard to these conversations, these check-ins. Of course, all of us have experienced a certain amount of fatigue with doing most of this virtually. The one-on-ones in particular, yes, you want to have the solidity of the weekly or the bi-weekly check-in. How do you make sure that that's not seen as micromanaging? And I just want to say that this is the last question I'm going to ask, because we're getting a ton from the audience, so I'm going to turn it back over shortly, but answer this one for me.
Oh yeah. So how does it not come off? I think it's in the subs. I don't think the micromanaging, typically the issue is the frequency. It's the actual nature and quality of the discussion, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
We could be having a once a year check-in, and I'm like, Lydia, what have you done? What did you do January 1st? What did you do January 2nd? What did you do January 3rd? And we only meet once a year.
Yeah.
It's going to feel pretty micromanaging and not a frequency issue. You know what I mean? But if the one-on-one happens every week, and the one-on-one starts with, how are you doing as a human? How are you doing as a professional? How can I help you? What are your challenges? What's going really well? How can I help you? How can I support you? I mean, you could kind of do that every day and somebody might not get sick of
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
conversation. So I think it's the spirit behind it. And I think people can kind of read that, and it's the quality of, are the questions leading questions? Are they about commanding and control and trying to understand exactly how everything happened? Or is it about really, it's not about the output and how we got there, but it's about giving people autonomy to choose the how, as long as we're aligned on the end outcome and on the end result. People thrive when they're given creative autonomy about how they get something done within the reasonable constraints of human interaction and the company's core values and culture. So I think it's having really great quality check-ins, and I find it that I kind of prefer bi-weekly. Like, I like longer bi-weekly ones than really quick weekly ones, because if we're having like these deep conversations about how are you doing and what's missing from a work setting, and that's conversations, they typically take more than 15 minutes or 30 minutes. I think it's really kind of hard to have like hour-long check-ins or one-on-ones with each direct report, depending on how many you have. So I kind of like every other week, but this is so unique. I like kind of every other week, go 45 minutes or go an hour, kind of really steep in substance and quality and depth in that time. And sometimes I even like to have a monthly or quarterly coaching one where we're not talking about what work got done. It's not like a tactical one. It's just kind of like, let's zoom out. And it's like, without asking it so directly, hey, is this working for you? Is this working for me? How can we share some feedback with each other? Let's help each other grow. What have you noticed in my leadership that I can improve on? Right? That's a really powerful question to ask, which is like, I want to be the best supporter and leader for you. I'm not perfect. I am still growing. Are there ways that I could be better support? Or are there behaviors that you've noticed that probably come from a place of good intention, but are just kind of missing the mark and are not helping you or the team lead? And I think feedback is two ways, and I think we earn feedback by the way that we respond to the feedback. Do we get defensive and punish, or are we open and actually change? And the more that there's a virtuous cycle of, oh, you give me feedback and I seriously consider it and I change it where it's authentic to me and I receive it. You give it more, you receive it better. It's kind of like a human relationship almost.
Imagine that. Well, I think that, it's very true that some managers are very easily go to this place of, if they're getting any negative feedback or hear anything sort of through the grapevine that's negative about their own performance, that it kind of tends to shut things down. But that openness, that authenticity to say, what do you think I could be doing better, definitely is a building block of that virtuous cycle, as you mentioned. I want to get to the audience questions. They are coming in thick and fast. Thank you, everyone, for chiming in. We'll get to as many as we can. So one that I'm seeing here is, how do we empower our managers to make decisions that are equitable and not based on personal preference? For example, work location or ways of working. That's interesting.
Yeah, that is a fascinating question. How do we support our managers? So I think that I think this is probably coming from somebody in human resources is likely my assumption here. And I think at the highest level, while the local level at the manager level really matters, the role of centralized policies and expectations and centralized training is still important. This is where bias training can be really effective, where it's just part of being a manager means that we talk about what is equity. How do we make equitable decisions? How can we become more aware of unconscious bias in our decisions on a day-to-day basis? And so I think human resources plays an important part in creating a container for the conversation to happen, and then having a feedback loop in place to, one of the things that, so at Emplify, the company that I co-founded and sold to 15.5, it's now 15.5 Engage, it's what it's called. And Engage measures the employee engagement for a company, but it measures it for different groups. And you can actually kind of get a metric of the sense of equitableness that employees feel it's literally one of the questions is, do you feel like leadership and management makes equitable decisions about, people's compensation and other aspects of their work?
Mm-hmm.
And when you start to see like the heat map grid, and you start to see that there's a dearth of equitable decisions in one specific location and everywhere else is doing pretty well, as
Mm-hmm.
human resources professional, that's a feedback loop. You now have data that the centralized programming and policies and training that we created isn't working here, and we have an opportunity to have an intervention, with that manager, not like a 10 people like, hello, this is an intervention, but like, hey, we're noticing some data. We hold equity and equitable decisions is important in this organization. It's not going well. Let's work together to figure out how we can best support and help you. It's almost like that same posture that the manager has for the employee,
Right.
but from the HR person to the manager. So I think it's setting the table, creating centralized policies, training, expectation, then having data about how it's going, and then closing the loop and rectifying the places in the system that have specific, and celebrating those who are particularly great at making equitable, decisions. It's something that HR has the opportunity to support, train, and then not tolerate when they're seeing issues. But that's why it's really important to have that data-driven feedback loop, because it's like the difference between an HR person going to a manager and saying, hey, I don't think you're making equitable decisions, versus like, hey, the data says you're not making equitable decisions, is a very different conversation.
Yeah.
From like okay, prove your feelings to me, to, oh,
here are the numbers. Yeah.
Here are the numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we invariably, no matter what the topic, there's always the question on, how do you make a business case for XYZ? And that's sort of the same thing as you're making the case for it using the numbers. It's irrefutable. So Dan wants to know, are there thoughts on those managers who may not feel comfortable showing genuine open heart, strong back, facial cues on camera in the new virtual environment? That's an interesting one.
That's those managers may not yet feel comfortable showing a genuine open heart, strong back. If it's really bad, like, let's have a phone conversation, right? If somebody's at some point, right, if we're like really early on in the journey of development with this, like, that's okay, right? We're all where we're at. It's just important that we seek to further on the effectiveness spectrum here. And so I think it's accepting where we're at, and then thinking about what's my growth edge. And so from that perspective, yeah, I think for someone who struggles sharing more of their authentic kind of self, I just keep thinking about like therapy is great, for being able to, as someone who could feel certain emotions a few years ago and literally didn't have access to feeling other emotions that were like pretty repressed, it really held me back from being able to relate to people on the full spectrum of the human experience. And of course, there's, I think, ways of displaying emotions that are appropriate for work and not appropriate for work. But I think in general, especially younger generations crave authenticity. They would literally have like a video that's like shaky on an iPhone, that it's real, versus like a really slick produced thing from a Fortune 500 company. So I think it's accepting where we're at, but acknowledging that not being able to engage on the full kind of spectrum of our human experience in an authentic way, like, I think does hold us back. And I think we should, like, if we want to be leaders, I think that will limit our effectiveness. And maybe if this is an area that's really difficult for this individual, maybe they're not cut out for a managerial and a leadership role. Maybe managerial, but it's going to be really hard to not be fully tapped in with our feelings, when so much of leadership is that art of inspiring humans and creating meaning, which are just these like kind of non-rational parts of life. That's a I don't know if I answered that super well, but that was my best take.
No, that's, yeah, you have to answer based on your experience.
Yeah.
Leah wants to know, what are some areas we should focus on with current managers to help them feel like more empowered as leaders? And I encourage you to answer this with an eye towards this hybrid remote type working arrangement.
Yes. I think one really important thing that is so, I think, overlooked many times is giving managers, especially middle managers, the appropriate context about what's going on in the business. I think many times they are, especially middle managers or frontline managers, aren't part of those senior leadership vision strategy conversations and don't have enough context to make really good decisions that would be that they would then feel empowered to make. When I don't know where the direction is headed and what our strategy is, it's really hard for me to be confident of how to make a decision without that business's context. I think tools like whether it's Strengths Finder or Enneagram or DISC, self-awareness tools to understand themselves and their teams better can be really fantastic, because now I know, hey, usually when I'm wrong on a decision, it's not because I looked at the data and came up with the wrong decision. It's typically because I missed a really important data point. Like I know my own kind of ways that I can make mistakes, the archetype of them, and I can just scan for them every time. And that makes me a lot more confident in making decisions, because I know I'm probably not wrong if I've checked these boxes, because this is usually the one that gets me. And that comes from an awareness that this type of kind of personality, and none of us can be boiled down to and simplified by a personality test or an archetype, but they can be really helpful in growing our self-awareness. So I think self-awareness is a key one. And I think that data-driven leadership development, I think, is one of the most exciting areas, because what I need to develop as a leader is different than what you need to develop as a leader, Lydia, based on our backgrounds and personalities. And being able to have someone coaching me that is aware of who I am and even the engagement levels of my team and how my team feels about me can be a really tremendous tool in the tool belt.
I'm going to have you answer one more, and then we're going to have to turn it over to, well, I'm going to turn it back over to you. This question is, what should managers keep in mind about keeping up their diversity and inclusion efforts and general sense of belonging when people are scattered all over?
Yes, there are. I mean, we talk about, diversity is, do you kind of get invited to the party? Inclusivity is, do you get asked to dance?
Yeah,
right. And
true.
so you can sort of like have a lot of diversity without a lot of inclusiveness. And it's like, that's not cool. I get invited to the party, but nobody dances with me. I'd rather like not even have gone, to the party. And of course, the DEI conversation rightfully has been, the frame of the narrative has been primarily around issues of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, historically areas that need justice and correction. But as I hear this question, it's how to be inclusive of like different time zones and geographies.
Yeah. And that's really the biggest piece of this. And, as you and I were talking about offline, it's like we were equipped to do this, but nobody really understood the piece about inclusion with remote work before. And so there was a hierarchy, and now there needs to not be one. So what does that look like?
Yes. So HBR had this really interesting post called, in their big idea series, called The Future of Flexibility at Work. And I was kind of reading it as prepping. And it talks about that the traditional approaches to this have been accommodation, which is kind of like the case by case approval of like, I have a doctor's meeting or I got to go to this. And it's kind of like by exception basis. And the other extreme is this idea of boundaryless working, work whenever, wherever, but that also means that like work never ends because there's no like boundaries to it. And so I think what it proposes, and I agree with, is a balanced and better way where there's both a top down and a bottom up process where leaders listen, set goals, and provide resources to make flexibility possible. But employees choose flexible working that suits their needs while communicating with their managers and colleagues to ensure that team, client, and customer requirements are met. In other words, this is the best part. The company provides the scaffolding, flexibility options, equipment, and supportive performance management systems, and individual employees and teams decide how to organize their work within it. So I think that's really interesting. So let's just say that this team across time zones, it's not just cool for people to work from wherever. That would be the most like maybe pro employee position, the most flexible. But it doesn't really balance the needs for the business, which is like, hey, meetings need to happen with people from multiple time zones. So what one way that this flexible model can do is, hey, we're going to have core hours, and it's these 3 or 4 hours that actually are possible for all time zones. And we're all going to commit that we're going to be on Slack and available for meetings during these 3 or 4 core hours during the day, these 2 or 3 days a week, or all 5 days a week. Outside of that, you get lots of flexibility of where and when that you work. That would be one team's example of how to have the Venn diagram of employee flexibility and pro-employee flexibility and autonomy, and also something that sustainably works for the organization, for that team to accomplish their task for the organization's goals.
Okay. There are so many questions. Folks, thank you so much for all these. I'm going to encourage you to reach out to Santi via LinkedIn or through 15Five and make the connection, and perhaps you can have a discussion with all of these questions that you have offline. I'm going to turn it over to Santi now, so he's got some things to say.
Thanks all for sticking around. Hopefully this has been of value to you. Really quickly, I'm just really excited about being part of 15Five. I've been at 15Five for 6 months. And what I've seen is that 15Five bakes in all of the best practices of good management and leadership into software and services that companies can buy and adopt, and so much is taken care of. So, 15Five's products are employee engagement, how to measure employee engagement, performance management, how to actually do performance management that is actually enjoyable and easy for HR and actually leads to better performance reviews that don't suck and people don't hate. But things like, it has a one-on-one tool, which is you can put your agenda items as a manager and as an employee, and that serves as your agenda talking points, and it carries them forward, and you can write notes in there. It just kind of makes everything easier of how to be a manager and a leader. And that, of course, facilitates the job of HR so much more. So there's things for managers in there that they can use, and there's things for HR like performance reviews, engagement surveys, OKR, and goal alignment. And what's really cool, lastly, about 15Five is that not only is it a software company, but it also has an amazing HR superstars community. It's free. You can join without being a 15Five customer. You can share best practices with other HR leaders. But I think the coolest part is the services. 15Five literally has coaches that look at engagement data and work with managers on how to create more engagement in their teams and become better managers and leaders based on the engagement data that's coming out. So that's what 15Five is about. Just wanted to take 45 seconds to share that with you. If you'd like to learn more, there's going to be a poll here. If you'd like to learn more about 15Five products and services, if you're not interested, no worries at all. I hope you got a lot of value. If you are, you might see a follow-up from us on ways to find out more. Turn it over to Steve to close us out.
Thank you, Santi, and to Lydia. That was an excellent conversation, and you could see the level of engagement by all those questions you had. Thanks again to our sponsor, 15Five, and to all of you for participating today. Before we sign off, I want to quickly mention one of our upcoming webinars that might be of interest to you. On Tuesday, October 26th, we'll be hosting a webinar titled Judging the Relevance of Skills Credentials, which we'll be hosting in partnership with AARP. If you look in the chat space now, you'll see a link to our page where you can find out more and register for the event. This webinar will seek to answer the question, is your recruiting strategy inclusive to all ages? Our expert panelists will talk about the importance of understanding the marketplace for educational credentials. There are so many of them right now in this era of upskilling and reskilling. And the speakers will share promising practices from other employers on how they're approaching this challenge to ensure you're not missing out on exceptional talent and opportunities. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. Stay well.